In this talk, we're going to discuss a technique for building the most flexible context for building sub-summary reports inside FileMaker. But the techniques for sub-summary reporting in FileMaker do apply to other technologies such as PHP. So what about Atomic? We'll get to that. First, I want to go over a fairly simple example. It's actually not that bad. This is a real-life solution which, when broken down into its hierarchical entity relationships, is fairly familiar to most FileMaker developers. The requirements for this example, and this is a real-life example, were threefold. First of all, we need to be able to report on a number of different tables in this hierarchy, and we need to, for all the reports, we need to extract totals from the date range that's specified dynamically at runtime by the user, and then a predetermined 1 year offset from that, both those date ranges showing as columns on the same report. And we need to be able to show the percent change between those two ranges, those two columns, and the percent the percent of the total that each row represents. So here's some examples of mock-ups that kind of illustrate what those three requirements are after. Here's an example of a report that shows totals for the reps, the sales reps. You can see there's the current percent of total, current average, and the same for the previous date range, and there's the percent change between the two periods. So all of these have the same sorts of comparisons. This date range to the previous date range, percent change, percent of total. This one happens to be run against products. Here's another one against products. Different sub-summaries over there. Here's another one on products. Here's one on locations, sub-summarized in a different way. More location examples, another product example. Lots of different reports here. Here's another one from locations. All aggregating information together, pulled from different places within this hierarchy. So back to the idea of Atomic. The dictionary defines atomic as of or forming a single irreducible unit or component in a larger system. That's one of many definitions for atomic if you look it up, but it's one that suits my purposes here and which gets to the heart of what we're trying to describe. What we're not talking about, for people that have heard the phrase or computer science majors, there is this concept in database and programming circles of an atomic operation. That's more of something that it's a process that other processes can call and which returns only one of two possible results, essentially a binary result. And that is not what we're using atomic to mean here. So the question is, given that definition of atomic, have I been misleading you? I showed you the hierarchy, and I showed you three different contexts that I need to run reports on. But what is the atomic context in this hierarchy? The experienced developers among us will immediately recognize that the most irreducible unit in this entire hierarchy here is the invoice line items. Now this is a really important thing, and in this particular example, it's a fairly natural occurrence, and that's why I'm using it as an illustration. But it is sometimes useful and important to create an atomic context. And as you can see, all of the example reports, the 8 different reports that I mocked up, I plan on doing from the invoice line items, even though not one of them occurs at the invoice line items level. So the question is, for those of you who haven't done this before, well, how can that possibly be? We don't see any invoice line items in the reports, and we need to extract two different date ranges. So how can we get a found set? We obviously need the actual date range defined by the user, but we also need the same date range in the previous year. Furthermore, it's challenging because we need to compare these two values. So how could you possibly do that at the invoice line items level? Well, let's answer those questions one by one. First of all, there is no rule that you must display a body. So take a look at this layout here, one of the reports. It has a header, sub-summary by a field, trailing grand summary, and a footer. There's not a body here at all. So that was the rep report. As you can see, we got found sets on the invoice line items, and then we simply didn't display that information. We just displayed summary information only. That was the most simple of the reports, and the same principle applies to all of them. The second question, there's what I'm calling this is conditional atomic values. So what we're doing is we're creating unstored calcs that take into account dates entered by the user to establish a condition which returns a true or false. So if the invoice line item date is greater than or equal to the beginning date and the invoice line item date is less than or equal to the ending date, then it's true. Otherwise, it's false. Now, that's not in and of itself extremely useful, but in a second we'll extend that out to do something useful with it. The next point to make here is we can create the same true or false relationship by unstored calculation simply by by converting the beginning and the end date to be offset by a year. So now we use the same two dates, but we define that to be basically the year minus one, the same date, year minus one, and now we can do the same thing. If it's greater than or equal to the beginning date or less than or equal to the end date, it's true, otherwise it's false. So once we can do that, rather than returning true or false, what if we were to return whatever value it was we were trying to summarize? So in this case, total price, invoice line item total price, is returned if it's true, but if it's not true, meaning if this particular invoice line item is out of date range, we return 0. So to take that just a little bit farther, we can do something slightly more interesting than going back to what I was just showing, just simply returning the price. We could instead return some manipulated value. So let's say, for example, we want to know the average price across the entire set of data. We can take the factor for averaging and do it on this one line item, and then when we total them up, we get an average across the entire set of data. So here, if we take the same, back up a slide here, the same invoice line item total price, and we divide that by the averaging factor, we do the math on it, then we can return the average value for that one individual line item. The way we extend this to be useful in the summary report is we then take that conditional atomic value from the invoice line item, and here we can see it as a calculated field down here in the available field section of our summary field definition, and then here we're creating a field of the same name but defined as a summary field, which is a total of our average calculation. So you can see this one is using any naming convention you like, but using this naming convention is inside the current date range. So this one is going to average. This particular summary field is going to return the average of only the line items in the found set that fall within the current date range, and then we do the exact same thing for the average of all the line items that fall within the previous date range. And obviously, because the line items that fall within the previous date range return 0, in the summary, in the previous summary, they won't affect that total. So let's take a look at that. Here are our two columns. These are our calculated conditional atomic values. Looking at this, the set of data that occurs within the previous date range, on the left-hand column we have values. On the right-hand column we have all zeros. Moving down to the part of the found set that falls within the current date range, the left-hand column is all zeros, and the right-hand column is returning the values. So the conditional atomic values let us do this. But what about this? So take a look. It's easy enough to do summary fields and return, going back to what we were just, the first thing it lets us do, return summaries. We can summarize these. So we can summarize the totals, we can summarize the averages for the current and the previous, no problem, right? But how do we do this? Here we're doing math on summaries. We're doing math on values that don't actually exist in the data. So the trick to this, as many of you may know, is to use the getSummary function, which is essentially the ability to create a summary part but inside a calculation. And so just like a summary part, you need to define a break field, or a field that it's sorted by, when sorted by. And as it says in the help text, in a subsummary part for break fields, subsummary part records are grouped when sorted by values in another field called the break field. So whenever the value of the break field changes, the report breaks and FileMaker Pro inserts a subsummary. It's the same thing for a getSummary function. There's one little catch. Those fields must be local. Take a look at this. Right here in the help text. The getSummary function must be set up in the same table as the break field. Well, that's not all that useful, is it? GetSummary function must be set up in the same table in which you're summarizing the breaks by. Well, hang on a second. There is nothing that says that it can't be a calc field. So the trick is, and this is actually useful for a lot of other reasons, which I'll get into, bring all your calc fields, bring all your break fields to the atomic context as calc fields. Here you can see in this example all these CT is the naming convention that was established. These are all calculated text fields which are used as breaks for both the subsummary parts and for this getSummary functions, the calculations. So there's actually a bonus here. This has some big advantages and can be a technique worth adopting even when you're not doing subsummaries. You bring your remote fields to your local table. If your data isn't all that clean, you could end up with a whole bunch of them just returning no value. But if you're defining the break field as a calculation, you can say if is empty, the field, put in brackets or however you want to define it, product unknown. Otherwise, simply return the field. You can also do things like this. If you are returning, if you need to know that a certain part number is going to be defined as in a special way, and that everything else will be considered core business, then you can say if the product code equals this, then define the break field as SES. Otherwise, define it as core business, which essentially means everything else. So these are really useful things to do, and then they also make it somewhat easier to work with because there are no tables to define. There's no table : field name to deal with inside your calc expressions. So now that we've got this established, we can take fields that exist in remote tables and use them as break fields. Let's do some math. You can see here we're doing the getSummary function, and then we're defining a certain field to summarize the total price summary field, and then we're breaking whenever we see the location name. So this particular expression will evaluate properly when it's displayed inside a summary part that evaluates the same way, that breaks the same way. In other words, on location name, on our local calculated version of the location name. Now, divided by the total. So here we're trying to do, again, the summary that equals the particular summary part when broken by location, divided by the total. And here we're using the break as a constant. So you can sort by the same summary field or a constant to get grand summary values. In the help text, it suggests that you use the same summary field. So in this case, it would do total price SM divided by total, defined to break by total price SM. But in our case, we needed to use a constant for other reasons, and either one works the same way. So doing that, we now are essentially doing this math here on the Aaron Patterson row, the Aaron Patterson sub summary. Slightly different from the previous example because now we're on the rep report again, but here on the break by rep rather than location, we're getting 50,000 divided by 1.5 million equals 3%. And you can do slightly more interesting logic, for example, to prevent the divide by zero error, and to do negative or positive depending on which value is higher. There's all kinds of neat things you can do. So, in this slightly more complicated looking FileMaker expression, in fact what it ends up doing is this. It just simply, in this case, takes it always finds the lower number, which in this case happens to be the current total, and the previous total, and divides it into the higher number, which in this case is the current total, and conditionally it flips the positive or negative depending on which direction it's trying to show the result. So this is all very interesting, very useful, and works for all those sorts of reports. But guess what? This is not just for FileMaker. Sub-summarized records can be used for many, many things, and in this example, we want to display FAQ information from a database where we have a question and an answer as a part of the record, and then those are categorized. So the first group is submitting reworks, and here going back to it, there we see it on the way we want to display it. Here we see it as a drop-down value list on the record, on the FAQ record. So rather than, if you want to draw these things as HTML, one way to go about it would be to get the value list and then iterate down the value list and do a query for each value, and do a series of queries and see if there's any results. The other way to do it would just simply be to get all the records, go to the atomic context, right? Go get all the records and sub-summarize them. So here, let's take a look at in this case, we limited it to only 6 records with 2 different categories to make the example easier to look at. And 3 of the categories are submitting whatever it is, and the other 3 are viewing units. And you can see that those are just not denormalized attributes of the individual rows. So what we're doing here is in PHP is we're doing simple find for all the records. Then we're going to sub-summarize by looping over the records, and every time we find a record, we pull out the category, create a group of the category name, and then stick the record inside that, appending it each time. That's what the empty brackets are for. So check it out. Magically, category, we could just as easily call it break field. So category, little pixie dust, is the break field. And what we end up with is a series of named associative arrays with each one holding the name of the subsummary part. In other words, being the break field, it's named by break field. So now we can iterate over those in order. So it's a great way to order and sort. So we simply do an outer loop over the categories and then an inner loop over the records inside the categories. And there's our first group, dump out the records. There's our second group, dump out the records, and so on. So let's just briefly review the two important concepts that we covered here, which are applicable both to FileMaker subsummary reporting and many other database technologies. Atomic context, again, a coined phrase, I think. Not aware of a formal definition for it, and I'm using it as out of convenience. Really, just as the individual definitions of the two words. We want the irreducible context. Keep your eye out for atomic context, because if you find yourself considering complicated calculations like we've all done to extract report data and pull it up to you from child records, which sometimes you have to do if you're doing this for screen display. But if you're doing this for reports, take a second look and see if you can find a more atomic context. As I mentioned before, sometimes there's not a natural atomic context that occurs, or sometimes the atomic context is actually a join table. There's no reason you can't actually run all your reports from a table which simply contains the keys for your other data and doesn't have any data of its own. You would just simply need to bring in all of your break fields, do your subsummaries at your join level, and in that case you wouldn't be, more than likely you wouldn't actually be summarizing any data at the join level. You're just aggregating together things from different tables. But again, it's hallmarks of it are look for tables that have lots of records that relate to everything. Look for the smallest part. That's the place to be. And if you can't find it, sometimes it's worth creating one using batch processes or whatever. And you can also do certain little tricks, like for example, if you need to make sure that, like for an inventory type report, that every part is represented in the report, even if there aren't invoice line items for it, you can aggregate, again, this is kind of chunky and clunky, but find your atomic context, aggregate together the invoice line items, and then do a comparison to your inventory table using like a go to related records entire found set, flip to the items that didn't exist in your found set, and then iterate over those and populate dummy data that doesn't relate otherwise, essentially orphan data that does nothing other than relate to the inventory, and gives you an empty result for the inventory item. That way when you do your subsummaries, you still get a representative for every inventory, every element in the inventory, even if there aren't line items at your atomic context. Many people would attempt to do that report from the inventory table and pulling all that summary data up to the inventory data table. In my opinion, it's much better to go to the atomic context, the line items, and report from there. The other concept that we all use, we all know what it is, but I wanted to point out is subsummary. Subsummary is unique to FileMaker. It's a word, actually, believe it or not, I looked it up, I was searching and I found a reference to it in a patent database with Chris Krim's name attached to it. So I suspect that there may even be patents surrounding the word, which is why we don't see it used in other technology contexts. But it's a very useful concept, and and defined kind of in an overly detailed way to kind of this or that or AKA it. A subsummary is simply a field or a column representing a denormalized or non-unique attribute, which when treated as a group, i.e. break field, for all the records, i.e. rows, sharing the attribute. In FileMaker, we do this by defining the part or defining the break field for the getSummary function and sorting. That does our grouping. In PHP, we can do the same exact concept by appending records into associative arrays named as the break field values. So it's the same concept of finding that granular context and aggregating the data together by grouping the data together by attributes, whether you're stuffing those into associative arrays or sorting them and displaying them in subsummary parts. So taking away those two concepts, I think if you mull those over, you'll be able to apply those to many areas of your database design life. And that's the end of my presentation.